1915. The Great War was bogged down in the mud and slaughter of the Western Front. The Allied powers desperately sought a new way, a masterstroke to break the deadlock. Their audacious plan forced the Dardanelles Strait, knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war, and open a supply line to Russia. An immense fleet assembled. Among them were thousands of volunteer soldiers from the distant lands of Australia and New Zealand, the Anzacs. Eager for adventure and glory, they sailed halfway around the world for their first taste of war. The Ottoman defenders, dug into the rugged hills overlooking the beaches, waited for them. On April 25, 1915, under the pre-dawn sky, the Anzacs prepared to land. Nothing would go according to plan. This is the story of the Anzac landing at Gallipoli, a day of chaos, unimaginable courage, and brutal sacrifice that would define two nations. If you're ready to witness the forging of a legend in the crucible of battle, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into military history. What does the name Anzac mean to you? Let us know in the comments below. Now, to the shores of Gallipoli. April 1915. The Aegean Sea. In the clear azure waters off the coast of the Ottoman Empire, the largest amphibious invasion force the world had ever seen lay waiting. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, troop transports, a vast armada carrying soldiers from Great Britain, France, India, Newfoundland, and, most visibly, the newly formed Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, the Anzacs. Their target was the Gallipoli Peninsula, a rugged finger of land that guarded the western entrance to the Dardanelles Strait. This narrow waterway, connecting the Aegean to the Sea of Marmara and ultimately the Black Sea, was the strategic prize. Control the Dardanelles and the Allies could force a sea route to their beleaguered Russian allies, knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war, and potentially open a new front that could break the bloody stalemate in Europe. The plan was the brainchild of Britain's first Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill. It was audacious, imaginative, and fraught with risk. An initial attempt in March to force the straits using naval power alone had ended in disaster. Older British and French battleships, steaming into the narrow channel, had run into undetected Ottoman minefields and accurate shell fire from shore batteries. 3 battleships were sunk, 3 more crippled. The naval attack was abandoned. Plan B was now in motion. A land invasion to seize the heights overlooking the Dardanelles, silence the Ottoman guns, and allow the fleet to pass through to the Ottoman capital, Constantinople, modern Istanbul. Command of the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force, MEF, was given to General Sir Ian Hamilton, a veteran of numerous colonial wars, but with little experience in orchestrating such a complex, large-scale operation against a determined, modernizing enemy. The Ottoman defenders were not the crumbling, decadent force many in the Allied High Command imagined. While the Ottoman Empire was undeniably in decline, its army had undergone significant modernization efforts in the years leading up to the war, largely under the guidance of German military advisors. Command of the Ottoman Fifth Army, tasked with defending the Gallipoli Peninsula, had been given to the experienced German general Liman von Sanders. Von Sanders, arriving just weeks before the invasion, quickly recognized the weaknesses in the existing defensive plan, which dispersed forces thinly along the coastline. He implemented a new strategy: hold the beaches lightly with outpost troops, keep the bulk of his forces concentrated in mobile reserves inland, and launch immediate decisive counterattacks to drive any landing force back into the sea before they could establish a secure foothold. It was a flexible, aggressive defense perfectly suited to the terrain and the nature of amphibious warfare. The soldiers manning the defenses were predominantly Turkish infantrymen. These were tough, peasant soldiers, accustomed to hardship, fiercely patriotic, and capable of incredible endurance. They were generally well led by Turkish officers, many of whom were young, nationalistic, and eager to defend their homeland against the invaders. While their equipment was often older than that of the Allies, they were skilled marksmen, adept at using the rugged terrain for cover, and supported by well-sighted Krupp artillery pieces and Maxim machine guns. They knew their land, and they were prepared to fight for it, with a tenacity that would shock the Allied invaders. Von Sanders positioned his 6 available divisions, strategically holding his best units, like the 19th Division commanded by the capable and ambitious Lieutenant Colonel Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk, the founder of modern Turkey, in reserve near the center of the peninsula, ready to react quickly to any landing. The Allied plan called for 2 main landings on April 25th. The British 29th Division, along with French colonial troops, would land at Cape Helles, the southern tip of the peninsula, aiming to capture the heights overlooking the strait's entrance. Further north, the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, commanded by Lieutenant General Sir William Birdwood, was assigned a landing zone on a relatively flat stretch of beach north of a prominent headland called Gaba Tepe. Their objective was to push rapidly inland, seize the Sari Bear Ridge, the mountainous spine of the peninsula, and cut off the Ottoman forces defending the southern tip, preventing them from being reinforced. It was a crucial role, requiring speed and aggression. The Anzacs themselves were an unknown quantity. Composed almost entirely of volunteers who had flocked to the colors at the outbreak of war, they were physically imposing, fiercely independent, and eager to prove themselves on the world stage. They had spent months training in the deserts of Egypt, honing their skills but lacking any real combat experience. They possessed a certain naive confidence, fueled by imperial propaganda and a belief in their inherent superiority as fighting men of the British dominions. They were about to receive a brutal education in the realities of modern industrial warfare. The plan for the Anzac landing was complex. The first wave, consisting of 1,500 men from the Australian 3rd Brigade, would land just before dawn from towed rowboats, achieving tactical surprise. They were to push inland immediately, securing the initial heights. Subsequent waves, ferried ashore by destroyers and transports, would follow rapidly, fanning out to seize the wider objectives on the Sari Bear Ridge. Speed was paramount. Hamilton and Birdwood believed that if the Anzacs could seize the high ground within the first few hours, before the Ottomans could react in force, the entire peninsula could be unhinged. The designated landing beach north of Gaba Tepe was chosen because it offered relatively easy access to the ridge system. Intelligence suggested it was lightly defended. This assessment, like so many others in the Gallipoli Campaign, would prove tragically wrong. In the dark, early hours of April 25, 1915, the massive Allied fleet approached the Gallipoli coast under a moonless sky. Aboard the transports carrying the Anzacs, the mood was a mixture of nervous excitement and apprehension. Men checked their Lee Enfield rifles, adjusted their heavy webbing, and wrote last letters home. They were crammed shoulder to shoulder on the decks, waiting for the order to board the landing craft. The first wave, the men of the 3rd Australian Brigade, transferred to battleships and then climbed down rope ladders into strings of open rowboats, known as cutters or tows, each pulled by a small naval steam pinnace. Absolute silence was enforced. The plan depended on achieving surprise. As the pinnaces towed the cutters towards the dark, unseen shore, something went wrong. Whether it was due to navigational error by the young naval midshipmen steering the boats, unexpectedly strong currents, or a combination of factors, the flotilla drifted significantly north of the intended landing zone. Instead of aiming for the flat beach north of Gaba Tepe, they were heading towards a jagged, unforgiving section of coastline dominated by steep cliffs and narrow, treacherous ravines. They were heading for Ari Bernu Point, a place that would soon be known to the world simply as Anzac Cove. As the boats neared the shore, around 4:30 a.m., the silhouette of the land became visible against the slightly lightening sky. It was not the flat beach they expected, but a looming wall of dark hills rising almost directly from the water's edge. At that moment, a single flare hissed into the sky from the heights above, followed by the unmistakable crackle of rifle fire. An Ottoman outpost had spotted them. Surprise was lost. The naval pinnaces cast off the tow ropes, leaving the heavily laden rowboats to cover the final distance to shore under their own momentum and the frantic pulling of oars. Suddenly, the darkness erupted. From the cliffs and gullies overlooking the beach, Ottoman machine guns and rifles opened fire. Bullets whipped across the water, thudding into the wooden boats and tearing through flesh. Men who had traveled 10,000 miles without seeing combat were killed or wounded before they even set foot on enemy soil. Oars were shot from hands, boats drifted off course, and the carefully planned waves dissolved into a chaotic scramble for the shore. The first Anzacs hit the beach around 4:30 a.m. It was not a beach, but a narrow strip of sand and pebbles, barely 30 yards wide in places, immediately rising into steep, crumbling cliffs and spurs covered in thorny scrub. The men, weighed down by over 60 pounds of equipment, leaped from the boats into the cold water and charged across the sand, seeking whatever cover they could find at the base of the hills. The initial Ottoman resistance came from perhaps 2 companies of the 27th Infantry Regiment, maybe 200 men, scattered in trenches and outposts along the heights. But they were well positioned, firing down onto the exposed beach. Casualties mounted quickly. Men were hit as they waded ashore, cut down as they tried to organize on the narrow beach, or shot as they began the desperate climb up the steep slopes. Command structure broke down almost immediately in the darkness and confusion. Companies became mixed. Platoons separated. Officers struggled to identify objectives or direct their men. The carefully laid plans, rehearsed for weeks in Egypt, evaporated in the first 5 minutes of contact. Despite the chaos and the deadly fire, the Anzacs displayed an astonishing, almost reckless courage. Driven by adrenaline and the sheer instinct to get off the exposed beach, they began scrambling up the near vertical slopes. They clawed their way up loose scree, pulled themselves up by thorny bushes, using their bayonets as handholds. Small groups of men, often led by NCOs or even determined privates, pushed forward on their own initiative, attacking Ottoman machine gun posts with grenades and bayonets. The fighting was confused, fragmented, and incredibly brutal. Anzacs and Turks stumbled upon each other in the dim light, fighting desperate, impromptu duels amidst the rocks and scrub. The initial Ottoman defenders, heavily outnumbered by the now arriving subsequent waves of Anzacs, fought stubbornly, but were gradually overwhelmed or forced to fall back, firing as they retreated up the complex network of ravines and spurs. Within the first hour, against all odds, the Anzacs had secured a precarious foothold on the heights immediately overlooking the cove. They had achieved the impossible, scaling cliffs under fire and driving back the initial defenders. But their ordeal was just beginning. They were disorganized, scattered across unfamiliar, treacherous terrain, their initial objectives forgotten in the chaos. And crucially, the Ottoman reserves were now alerted, and the architect of the defense, Mustafa Kemal, was already on the move. As the sun began to rise over the Gallipoli Peninsula on April 25th, it illuminated a scene of utter chaos at Burnu, the place soon to be immortalized as Anzac Cove. The narrow beach was choked with thousands of men pouring ashore from subsequent waves of landings. Wounded soldiers lay groaning on the sand, waiting for overburdened medics. Dead bodies floated in the gentle surf, or lay sprawled at the water's edge. Equipment lay scattered everywhere. Discarded packs, rifles dropped by the wounded, boxes of ammunition broken open. Under intermittent but accurate shrapnel fire from Ottoman artillery batteries further inland, men desperately tried to organize themselves into coherent units, shouting for their platoons, their companies, their battalions amidst the deafening noise. But the intricate order of battle, so carefully planned, had completely dissolved in the face of the unexpected terrain and the enemy resistance. Men from different units found themselves thrown together, often leaderless, seeking direction in the swirling confusion. Despite the chaos, the initial momentum of the landing carried small groups of Anzacs further inland, pushing up the steep ravines and spurs that radiated from the cove. This was driven less by coordinated command and more by the aggressive spirit of the soldiers themselves and the initiative of junior officers and NCOs who found themselves in charge. Their training had emphasized speed and the bayonet charge, and fueled by adrenaline, they pushed forward, eager to close with the enemy and seize the high ground. Small parties of Australians and New Zealanders, often numbering just a dozen or a few score, advanced rapidly up key features like Plug, S Plateau, Russell, S Top Walker, S Ridge, and towards the vital initial objectives known as Baby 700 and Battleship Hill on the main Sorry Bear Ridge. In these first couple of hours, driven by sheer audacity, some Anzac units actually reached points remarkably close to their planned objectives, looking down onto the Dardanelles Strait itself. For a fleeting moment, the strategic prize seemed within their grasp. But this rapid, fragmented advance was creating a dangerous situation. The units pushing inland were becoming isolated, losing contact with each other and with the beachhead. Their flanks were exposed. Ammunition was running low, carried only in the pouches on their backs. And crucially, they were advancing into a landscape where the true enemy strength was only just beginning to make itself felt. Miles away, at his headquarters inland, Lieutenant Colonel Mustafa Kemal, commander of the Ottoman 19th Division held in reserve, received the first confused reports of Allied landings. Initial reports mentioned landings further south at Gaba Tepe, but soon, urgent messages began arriving about a major, unexpected landing at Ari Burnu. Kemal, a decisive and brilliant commander, immediately grasped the critical danger. He realized that if the Allied troops seized the high ground of the Sorry Bear Ridge, particularly the key peaks of Chunuk Bear and Hill 971, they would dominate the entire peninsula and cut off the Ottoman forces to the south. The battle, and perhaps the war, could be lost in a matter of hours. Without waiting for orders from his German superior, Lyman von Sanders, who initially believed the main landings were at Cape Hell, Kemal made a fateful decision. He ordered his entire division forward, force-marching them toward the sound of the guns at Ari Burnu. He famously told his men, "I do not expect you to attack. I order you to die. In the time which passes until we die, other troops and commanders can come forward and take our places." Leading his elite 57th Infantry Regiment personally, Kemal arrived on the scene just as the scattered, exhausted Anzac advance parties were reaching the crucial ridges. He found Ottoman soldiers from the 27th Regiment retreating in disarray, pursued by small groups of Australians. Kemal immediately ordered his men to fix bayonets and counterattack. This moment, perhaps around 10 Sadars a.m., was the turning point of the battle for Anzac Cove. The sudden appearance of fresh, disciplined Ottoman troops, charging downhill with bayonets fixed, crashed into the thinly spread, disorganized Anzac lines on the heights. The Australians and New Zealanders, who thought they had achieved their objectives, were stunned. Exhausted from their climb and the initial fighting, low on ammunition and lacking support, they were hit by a wave of determined attackers. The fighting on the ridges, particularly around Baby 700, the Neck, Russell's Top, and Pope's Hill, became incredibly savage and confused. Controls swayed back and forth. Small groups of Anzacs would be overwhelmed, forced back down the slopes, only to rally and charge back up again. Ottoman soldiers, equally brave, would push forward, only to be cut down by desperate Anzac rifle and machine gun fire. It was a soldier's battle, fought with bayonets, grenades, and clubbed rifles amidst the thorny scrub and jagged rocks. The terrain itself dictated the nature of the fighting. The Gallipoli Peninsula's interior was a labyrinth of steep, narrow ravines and sharp, complex ridges. Units became instantly lost. Visibility was often limited to a few yards. Control dissolved. Men fought in isolated pockets, often unaware of who held the ground just over the next rise. The Anzacs, burdened by their heavy equipment and unfamiliar with the landscape, struggled to coordinate. The Ottomans, fighting on their home ground and expertly guided by Kemal's officers, used the terrain to their advantage, infiltrating through hidden gullies to attack the Anzacs from the flank and rear. Ottoman machine guns, carefully sighted on dominating spurs, swept the slopes with deadly accuracy. Anzac machine guns, laboriously hauled up the cliffs, often struggled to find stable firing positions or clear fields of fire. Adding to the Anzacs' woes was the increasingly effective Ottoman artillery fire. While the initial landings had achieved some surprise, Ottoman gunners in positions further inland, including the dreaded batteries known as Anafarta Ani and Beachy Bill, began to zero in on the beachhead and the slopes beyond. Shells crashed down onto the crowded beach, exploding among the supplies and the wounded. Shrapnel swept the ridges, killing men who thought they had found cover. The Allied naval gunfire support, intended to silence these guns, proved largely ineffective. The Ottoman batteries were well camouflaged, often firing from reverse slopes, making them almost impossible for the ship's gunners to spot. Communications between the troops ashore and the fleet were unreliable, often relying on signal flags or runners. Fire missions were delayed, inaccurate, and sometimes fell dangerously close to friendly troops, forcing the Anzacs to hug the ground while their own battleships shelled them. By midday on April 25th, the initial Anzac dream of a swift advance to the Sari Bear Ridge had died. The scattered units that had pushed furthest inland were either wiped out, captured, or forced back by Kemal's relentless counterattacks. The front line, if such a term could be used in the chaotic terrain, began to solidify along a series of precarious footholds on the first ridges overlooking the cove. Places like Quinn's Post, Steele's Post, Courtney's Post, Pope's Hill. These were not planned defensive positions. They were simply the furthest points of the Anzac advance, clung to with desperate tenacity. The fighting was incessant. Ottoman snipers, masters of concealment, inflicted a steady toll. Machine guns swept any movement. Sudden, savage Ottoman bayonet charges erupted from hidden gullies, forcing the Anzacs into brutal close-quarters combat. Casualties mounted at an appalling rate. Medics worked frantically in exposed positions, often becoming casualties themselves. Evacuating the wounded back down the steep, treacherous slopes to the beach was a nightmare, taking hours for each man. As the afternoon wore on, the situation for the Anzacs became increasingly desperate. They held a tiny, fragmented perimeter, barely a mile deep in most places, clinging to the steep slopes under constant fire. Ammunition was critically low, water was scarce, and the heat was becoming intense. The wounded accumulated on the beach in their hundreds, their suffering exacerbated by the intermittent shell fire. The chain of command was still in disarray. General Birdwood, the Anzac commander, and his staff struggled to get ashore and establish a coherent picture of the battle. Orders issued were often based on inaccurate information and failed to reach the intended units in the chaos. Some senior officers ashore, overwhelmed by the slaughter and the apparent hopelessness of the situation, began to consider the unthinkable: evacuation. This sentiment reached General Hamilton aboard the battleship HMS Queen Elizabeth. He received messages suggesting the Anzacs could not hold their position and might need to be withdrawn. Hamilton, faced with the potential collapse of one of his main landings on the very first day, made a decision that would define the Gallipoli Campaign. He refused to countenance evacuation. His famous reply, signaled back to Birdwood, was unequivocal. "You have got through the difficult business. Now you have only to dig, dig, dig until you are safe." It was an order born of necessity. Withdrawal under fire would likely have been even more catastrophic than holding on. But it condemned the Anzacs to months of brutal trench warfare in their precarious, shell-swept foothold. As darkness fell over Anzac Cove on April 25th, the exhausted survivors did just that. They scraped shallow trenches in the rocky soil, piled up stones for cover, and braced themselves for the night. They had landed. They had faced the fire. They had clung to their sliver of hostile land. The legend of Anzac had been born in blood and chaos. But the battle for Gallipoli had only just begun. The Ottoman army had waited, and when the Anzacs landed, the brutal battle for the beaches and ridges erupted, setting the stage for an 8-month epic of courage and futility. The night of April 25, 1915, at Anzac Cove, was a descent into a new kind of hell. The exhausted Australian and New Zealand soldiers, clinging precariously to the steep hostile slopes, worked frantically under the cover of darkness to improve their shallow trenches. Digging was a nightmare. The ground was a mixture of soft, crumbling sandstone and hard rock, littered with thorny scrub. Shovels were scarce, having been discarded during the chaotic climb, so men used their bayonets, their hands, even their mess tins to scrape out rudimentary cover. All through the night, the sounds of digging mingled with the groans of the wounded awaiting evacuation. The sporadic crackle of rifle fire as Ottoman snipers probed the darkness, and the terrifying, unseen whistle of artillery shells crashing down onto the beach and the ridges. Sleep was impossible. Nerves were stretched to the breaking point. Yet they dug, driven by General Hamilton's order and the primal instinct for survival. The Ottoman forces, equally exhausted but holding the superior ground, did not relent. Mustafa Kemal, anticipating an Allied attempt to consolidate and push further inland at dawn, organized a series of probing attacks throughout the night. Small groups of Turkish soldiers, masters of infiltration and close-quarters fighting, crept down the ravines, attempting to dislodge the Anzacs from their precarious footholds. Fierce, localized fights erupted in the darkness, often decided by the brutal intimacy of bayonets and grenades. At key points like Quinn's Post, a particularly exposed and vital position on the forward slope of the second ridge, the fighting was continuous, a relentless cycle of attack and counterattack that would define the Gallipoli stalemate for months to come. The Anzacs held their ground, repulsing the probes with rifle fire and desperate charges of their own, but the cost was constant, a steady trickle of dead and wounded adding to the toll of the first day. When dawn broke on April 26th, the situation had solidified into a grim reality. The Anzacs held a tiny, roughly triangular perimeter, its base on the beach, its apex barely a mile inland on the first few ridges. They were overlooked on all sides by Ottoman positions on the higher ground of the Sari Bear Range. Any movement in daylight attracted immediate and accurate sniper fire. The beach itself, the only lifeline for supplies and reinforcements, was under constant observation and intermittent shell fire from Ottoman guns, particularly the battery near Gaba Tepe, nicknamed Beachy Bill. Bringing supplies ashore and evacuating the wounded became a perilous round-the-clock operation conducted under fire. The dream of a swift breakthrough to the Dardanelles had vanished. The Gallipoli Campaign for the Anzacs had become a siege, with the paradoxical twist that they were the besiegers clinging to the outer edge, while the Ottomans held the fortress heights. The conditions within the Anzac perimeter quickly deteriorated to a level of squalor and hardship almost unimaginable. Sanitation was non-existent. Latrines were simply pits dug near the trenches, often overflowing in the heat. Flies, breeding in their millions on the unburied dead scattered between the lines and the discarded refuse, spread dysentery and enteric fever throughout the ranks. Clean water was desperately scarce, strictly rationed, and often contaminated. Food was monotonous and insufficient, primarily hardtack biscuits, tins of bully beef, corned beef, and jam, all consumed under the constant buzz of flies. Personal hygiene was impossible. Lice became endemic. Men lived for months in the same tattered, filthy uniforms, caked in mud, sweat, and often the blood of their comrades. The physical toll was immense, but the psychological strain was perhaps even worse. The constant proximity of death, the nerve-shredding tension of sniper fire and shell bursts, the sight and smell of decaying bodies, the sheer claustrophobia of the narrow, crowded trenches. It pushed men to the absolute limits of human endurance. Despite these horrific conditions, the Anzacs developed a unique culture of resilience, dark humor, and informal mateship. They adapted to the terrain, becoming masters of trench warfare themselves. They learned to dig deeper, to build stronger overhead cover, to move silently at night. A complex subterranean world developed, with tunnels dug for communication, shelter, and even offensive mining operations aimed at blowing up enemy positions. They developed a grudging respect for their adversary, the Turkish soldier, whom they nicknamed Johnny Turk or Abdul. They recognized his tenacity, his skill in defense, and his ability to endure hardship equal to their own. Brief, informal truces would sometimes occur, particularly after major battles, allowing both sides to retrieve their wounded and bury their dead lying in no man's land. These moments of shared humanity were fleeting islands in an ocean of brutality. The fighting never truly stopped. Major Ottoman counterattacks were launched in May and August, huge, costly assaults aimed at driving the Anzacs back into the sea. These were repulsed with horrific slaughter on both sides, often degenerating into savage hand-to-hand combat in the trenches. The Anzacs, too, launched their own offensives, most notably the August Offensive, a complex and ambitious attempt to finally seize the Sari Bear Ridge with coordinated attacks, including a major new landing further north at Suvla Bay by British troops. This offensive, while achieving some initial successes, like the New Zealanders briefly reaching the summit of Chunuk Bair, ultimately failed due to poor coordination, leadership indecision, and fierce Ottoman resistance, led once again by the indomitable Mustafa Kemal. The August Offensive was the Allies' last major gamble at Gallipoli, and its failure, with casualties exceeding 40,000, effectively sealed the fate of the campaign. By late autumn 1915, with winter approaching and no prospect of a breakthrough, the Allied command in London finally made the decision to evacuate. It was a tacit admission of defeat, a recognition that the strategic gamble had failed catastrophically. The evacuation itself, however, conducted in phases during December, was arguably the most successful part of the entire Gallipoli campaign. Under conditions of extreme secrecy, using elaborate deception techniques like self-firing rifles rigged to go off periodically, the Allies managed to withdraw nearly 90,000 troops from Anzac Cove and Suvla Bay over several nights without alerting the Ottomans and suffering minimal casualties. It was a masterfully executed operation, a final ironic success, salvaged from the jaws of a disastrous failure. The Gallipoli campaign was a catastrophe for the Allies. They suffered over 250,000 casualties, killed, wounded, and missing, including over 8,700 Australians and 2,700 New Zealanders killed in action. Yet, amidst the strategic failure and the appalling human cost, something profound and unexpected emerged from the crucible of Gallipoli. For Australia and New Zealand, the landing at Anzac Cove on April 25th became a defining moment in their national identities. It was perceived as the moment these young nations, born from the British Empire, stepped onto the world stage and proved their mettle through courage, endurance, and sacrifice. The Anzac spirit, characterized by bravery, ingenuity, egalitarianism, and unwavering loyalty to one's mates, became a foundational myth. April 25th, Anzac Day, became the most important national day of remembrance in both countries, a solemn occasion to honor not just the Gallipoli fallen, but all servicemen and women. The defeat at Gallipoli, paradoxically, became a source of immense national pride, a story of heroism in the face of adversity, a baptism of fire that forged distinct national characters. The Ottoman Army waited for the Anzacs to land, expecting perhaps a brief fight before driving the invaders back into the sea. They did not expect the raw courage that would scale the cliffs under fire. They did not expect the tenacity that would cling to that precarious foothold for 8 long months. They did not expect the resilience that would endure the heat, the flies, the disease, the shelling, and the constant proximity of death. The battle for the beaches that began on April 25, 1915, was a tactical nightmare born of strategic miscalculation and navigational error. But for the soldiers who fought there, and for the nations they represented, it became something more, a legend, etched in blood on the shores of Gallipoli.